Hello and welcome back to the Real Life Podcast, episode number 25. It's episode 2 of season 3. I'm on my ones again. I had planned something with my sister this week, given that we were both together for the first time in a while, which is rare. But given that we were on holiday, the time we wanted to find to do a pod together didn't quite materialise, so unfortunately we'll have to wait for that. In the meantime, I was thinking about what to do at short notice because I'm keen to make this upload schedule a bit more regular, and I realised it would be a good idea to begin a series where I talk about my favourite films and do a bit of dissection on them. I have a very many films that I could include on here, and if it inspires some more people to go and watch them, or maybe go and see some films that they wouldn't potentially have seen otherwise, then that's all good to me. I'm not just going to gush at you, I'm going to try my best to make the examination of the films as interesting as possible. Conveniently today, I'm going to go through a film that I recently wrote an essay on, and yes, it went very well, thank you. But it gives me an excuse to do a rather more highbrow study than you might normally hear on here, so I hope this isn't too nerdy, but I utterly adore this film. I think it's genuinely one of the best ever made. I think it's earnest. I think it makes you believe in it because of what it shows and how it shows it, rather than requiring any great shiny things to guide you in. It's also a film that, without fail, whenever I watch it, makes me want to crack open a cold beer to accompany my viewing. The film I am referring to is the criminally underrated, utterly masterful Hell or High Water. Here is a brief synopsis of the film. It's written by Taylor Sheridan and is directed by David Mackenzie, and it stars Chris Pine and Ben Foster playing brothers Toby and Tanner, who are out in the Midwest of Texas. Toby is a divorced father who's trying his best to make a better life for his sons. His brother Tanner is an ex-convict who has an itchy trigger finger and is a bit of a wild cannon. Together they play a series of heists against the bank that's about to foreclose on their family ranch. Standing in their way is a Texas Ranger, Marcus, who is played by the indomitable Jeff Bridges in what is one of the great underappreciated screen performances that there has been. Marcus is only a few weeks away from retirement, and him and his partner Alberto are trying to do their best to engage in this case and stave off the inevitability of sitting on that front porch for the rest of their life. This is one of the most thematically rich things I have ever come across, and I'm not quite sure why so many people missed it. There are incredibly detailed criticisms of the failing of American neoliberal world in this. The fear of retirement is there, the obsoletion and the death of a way of life, cultural and spiritual heritage being eroded, as well as a physical destruction, not to mention a fascinating approach in exploring masculinity and its many forms, despite the fact that they're all inherently linked. I'm going to begin with some context about the view the film was put under when it came out, though, because that changes some people's viewpoints massively. It came out in 2017, and as a result, due to a certain convicted felon, let's all just have a brief little party dance there, it got given a populist label in his name. People thought it was a populist message, which was inherently Trumpian. The Trumpian discourse, particularly at that time, involved trying to stimulate people by pitching them against the political establishment, presenting an alternative methodology to the usual political class aimed at engaging the working man into the fold. This is then done in an economically protectionist manner, famed for making people feel like the state is more in control of the monetary system. Obviously, Trump's version is a farcical mirage, but let's not turn this into me, moaning politically and stating my beliefs. I think the film is populist, but unideological, and whilst you could level with me and go, populism is an ideology, Dom, well, yeah, I mean, it is, but it isn't leftward or rightward leaning, is what I mean. It's simply displaying the failure of the neoliberal economic structures on the Midwest of America. The film is a display of the inevitability of new replacing old, as the severe cracks in American neoliberalism make themselves clear, and the conditions for a populist uprising are generated regardless of political colour. Side note, if you can hear really aggressive wind, there's really aggressive wind. I'm not breathing extremely invasively into the microphone. The oppressive structures of neoliberal institutions simply form the newest version of an evolving world order in this film, thus they're the direction in which people direct their anger to. People, quite often scholars say that populism dichotomizes society, revealing the people as being against an antagonistic entity. That's the idea. And though these dichotomies can be based on, any issue from race to ideology to gender, the focus of this film is on the neoliberalist bank as the prevailing antagonistic force. Whilst the film clearly posits characters who see no means by which to escape financial tyranny other than lawlessness, it carries a warning through its narratives that this path is one of danger and ultimately heavy loss. with that context in mind, let's get into the proper meat of the film. The setting of Hell or High Water feeds the mindsets of its characters, and the opening moments of the film show why the brothers feel compelled to take matters into their own hands. David Mackenzie's cinematic inclination is to show a crumbling local texture, observing dilapidated industrial estates, boarded up homes, and gives glimpses at billboards, all showing advertising debt relief. Not only reinforcing the economically depraved nature of the setting, but also showing that the influence of the banks and their economic power is literally plastered all over West Texas. Graffiti on the wall of a bank building in the opening shot laments the economic state of depression and describes how American soldiers who fought in Iraq have been abandoned and are subject to the same economic difficulty as everyone else. It reads, 3 tours in Iraq, but no bailout for people like us. Now, through that message, the film immediately generates an understanding that the brothers, carry out the robberies of what they perceive as necessity rather than the promise of financial gain. But what's interesting, obviously, is that sort of maybe gives an idea of sort of America First politics, which is maybe why people were keen to, put the Trumpian label on it. Texas Midlands is the institution that the brothers are targeting due to the reverse mortgage given to their mother. The evil in the film is the bank, not any political or judicial institution, and that's what makes what's being seen not Trumpian, but a display of the fraying of American neoliberalism. It's the bank that they're angry at, not a governmental force. The reverse mortgage is not revealed actually in the narrative until sort of the second act, meaning the brothers appeared to be acting unlawfully purely out of want. Their behaviour seems to be lacking the chivalrous, vigilante good aimed for by the classic Western outlaw. Instead, it appears as the sort of common criminal. The reveal shows them to be combating the economic power structure, which is oppressing their family as it is, countless others, thus giving them the sort of the chivalric ideal that a traditional Western presents. As a neo-Western, this has to borrow from the traditional ideas of a Western itself. It inherently has to try and do that. The loan itself is shown to be fairly egregious and exposes the callousness of the bank. The lawyer, Billy, says to both the brothers, they loaned the least they could, just enough to keep your mother poor on a guaranteed return. They thought they could swipe her land for $25,000. Now, given the shark-like nature of that loan, the audience is given the conditions to view the brothers as us and not just them, which is something from many people's reviews, as they face, the same problem affecting thousands. This isn't an isolated issue. This is a systemic problem. Jenny Ann, who is the waitress in the diner, her $200 tip would be crucial in paying her mortgage and, as she says, keeping a roof over her daughter's head. And it shows that mortgage to be a structure which keeps, those of a certain financial status economically suppressed. It is that notion which shows the film to be presenting conditions for a populism centred around neoliberal antagonism rather than a preconceived Trumpian ideal based on his ideas of race or anything like that. The regulation and also lack thereof of banks creates various benefits and burdens, primarily around the distribution and allocation of resources. And the steak restaurant in the town of Coleman highlights the lack of choice open to the people under the system. When Rangers Marcus and Alberto visit the restaurant to pass the time, a waitress asks them what they don't want, which is a really unusual question, and it takes them by surprise, and it's played as a gag, and it's a really, really funny gag. She says, I've been working here for 44 years, I'm not going to do the accent because you'd stop listening. I've been working here for 44 years. Only thing anyone's ever ordered is the T-bone steak and a baked potato. Don't have nothing but T-bones. So you either don't want the corn on the cob or you don't want the green beans. So what do you want? Side note, Margaret Bowman is just the best as the waitress. I honestly think nobody on the planet could have done that bit better than her. Also, her long spell working at that cafe, like she says, 44 years, is evocative of Toby's overarching motivation, which is revealed at the end of the film, as wishing to clear his family of the disease of poverty as a cyclical, fierce and immovable object in the way of any kind of freedom. The ranch itself that Toby owns echoes this. It's placed in a trust and it's not able to be sold. Toby's ex-wife Debbie notes that, great, this is something else I've got to take care of, fantastic. As the family are forced to remain trapped in that neoliberal structure, as, even after the death of their mother, they are denied the opportunity to economically benefit by selling the ranch. It has to stay where it is. Each aspect of the bank's dealings represent, by Taylor Sheridan's own words, failure in multiple senses. This is from an interview that he did in 2016. they are they're neglecting to effectively look after the poorest members of society, and they're actually exploiting them instead. The structural failings of good capitalism, quote unquote, prompted the brothers to feel so structurally powerless they have to move outside of the law to save their family. And from here, there's a really interesting idea to touch on. It's buried deep within the study of precarity and how capitalistic tendencies tend to prompt individual action. It's called the amoralism of opportunity. It's basically a concept that in becoming capitalistically successful, you have to abandon the morality of solidarity within your class, or plainly, you have to behave immorally in order to better yourself as an entrepreneur. Neoliberalism promotes the individual as the ideological beacon of society, and whether you agree with that or not, that's just what it does. But Hell or High Water shows a world where that is impossible to thrive in a morally acceptable way. The individual has to act alone, and the only people that can be bettered as a result are people who act only for themselves. Obviously here, being immoral is about breaking the law in the case of the brothers, but they can't make structural change. That's the important thing. Their plan only works because they do things in a manner which keeps the impact contained, not because they bring down the banks that they target. They don't bankrupt them. They don't ruin their business. They just better themselves. That's all it is. The amoral actions of the brothers, however, are fueled by a politics of inferno. I'm aware this is getting a bit politically deep and wanky, so I apologise, but that is a scenario in which people are denizens, not citizens, basically meaning they lack basic economic and social rights, and this type of insecurity completely undermines the idea of social solidarity. The results a significant growth in anger directed towards the state and towards institutions who fail to provide the support required, and as a result, the cleavages between rich and poor are widened massively. In essence, the Inferno scenario basically provides the conditions for populist uprising, which, as we know, is now a huge theme in this film. Except the brothers don't have the capital to enact uprising. Instead, they have to turn to illegal, individual, and opportunistic amoralism as a last resort. Amoralism of opportunity doesn't really make any allowances for circumstance or motivation for an action, but it's here we turn to the motivations of the brothers. Toby is desperate to free his family of the sickness of being poor, as he puts it. His focus is on giving his boys a better life, but makes a clear point to his son not to follow in his footsteps. But his motivation is absolutely familial, and as a result of his belief in the people he loves. That's why he's doing this. Tanner's motivations, on the other hand, they lie in the idea that he's simply cold to the world. His moralism has already been abandoned long ago after his stint in prison, and so his contempt for the structure of the world was pre-existing before we even met him in this film. Hence his excitement in robbing each branch and his desire to be Lord of the Plains, as the plains are where the people aren't. He wants to be king, but he wants to be king in a world where he can just be alone. Tanner's motivations show him to be such a socially detached denizen. That's who he is. He's someone who's completely embraced the Inferno scenario or whatever. He no longer finds his situation rescuable, and despite each brother having something different driving them to act opportunistically, their amoralism is no different to each other under this idea of immoralism of opportunity. The only difference is that Tanner has made peace with his abandonment of solidarity, whereas Toby finds that peace really difficult to negotiate because he's keen to be, even on a small scale, solidarity amongst his family. Chris Pine and Ben Foster are just perfect in these roles. They are such nuanced performances that could so easily just drop into the masculine bravado category and just feel like a waste of time, but ultimately they feel really genuine. They are polarized. Tanner is carefree, wild and untamed, looking for a genuine rush, and actually finally feeling good at something. I think that's a really interesting part of Tanner's character. He feels useful because he's completely at peace with what he's good at, which is robbing banks and breaking the law, and that's a subtlety which Ben Foster does amazingly to wrangle, because that character could so easily just be mad, but he isn't. There's a point early on in the film when they go into the ranch and see the mother's empty bed where she isn't anymore, and he talks about, how he could have helped, and, he probably couldn't have, but now he finally feels useful and like he's doing something this time for Toby. He is able to help in some form, even if it's not for his own personal benefit. He's off, gallivanting around wanting to be Lord of the Plains. Chris Pine slots in perfectly and reserves himself in just the right way to make sure that you feel his pain is genuine. Now, there are however, undeniable examples of the brothers' experience being a shared one. You know, when I talk about them acting individualistically, they aren't alone in their struggle. As previously mentioned, Jenny Ann shows her desperation to continue to keep her home for her daughter, regardless of the fraudulent money. So she also extends an olive branch to Toby, you know, noting how there's a spot open for employment as a chef in the diner, a life which Toby could have taken on the spot and just be calm and content and solidarity, but he doesn't. There is a want for solidarity amongst the people caught in the neoliberal oppression, and it's a solidarity shared by another patron of the diner, who's the local man with the Stetson who talks to Ranger Hamilton. He describes how the bank has been robbing him for 30 years, you know, emphasising that the switch to denizens is not total. Citizens remain, and there is room for community. It's on that basis that the brothers can be shown to make their amoral call, not just on a legal perspective, but actually on solidarity too, by abandoning the prospect of community and collective action, which is literally offered to them on a plate. They deny it, and they favour their individual success and their individual family's success. You know, solidarity amongst your family is fine, but it's not a broad church solidarity. However well-meaning Toby's morals and understanding of Jenny Ann are, he still leaves her behind. For the brothers, help is hard to find in an unpopulated place, so brotherhood becomes the crux of the film, and that's in a world where citizens aren't victims. They have to become vigilantes in order to free themselves of any kind of oppression. The film also presents a really interesting geographic barrier to the solidarity of the brothers with their economically struggling counterparts by consistently emphasising the distance between each town. If they didn't have a car, this is the Midwest of Texas, if they didn't have a car, this film would be over within 5 minutes. There are beautiful, sweeping shots of landscapes which, whilst gorgeous, are desolate, isolated, run down, and actually taken over by oil and industry, and not the kind of industry which, you know, promotes jobs. It's a very sort of capitalist-based industry. It's a deserted landscape, and it's a mined landscape. It's an exploited landscape, and that's the important thing. The focus of those shots is actually unspecific. It stays wide and it stays panning, and that just deepens the sense of how wide this space is, how thin the wealth lies, and how consistent the problem is across the whole of the Midwest. Here we move to another of the film's themes, which is heritage, and land specifically being completely intertwined with that. Taylor Sheridan himself, he claimed he wanted to make the landscape a character in the film and give the people who populate it a voice. And that means that territory and the aesthetic subject of it have to become, you know, an active player in the story, and that's from the author's eyes. Lots of people in the scholar world and outside of that say that culture is not, you know, an empirical objective, but it's explored in alternative methods. Cultural reality, here's a quote I've got in my essay, cultural reality is expressed through symbolic markers, and that's basically giving film and cinema and art a validity extending outside of its narrative content, because it means that the aesthetic choices make a difference. The landscapes offer physical and cultural depictions, and then when he was writing for the LA Times, Sheridan spoke of his motivation for writing the film. After a trip back to Texas saw him witnessing the end to a way of life, as he put it. This idea is then completely compounded when Sheridan himself turns up in the film as a cowboy, and he's guiding his cattle away from a fire which is engulfing their grazing land. The cowboy makes the point that, you know, this land and the lifestyle that comes with it is a prospect that would appeal to no one, noting it's the 21st century and I'm racing a fire to the river with 300 cattle. No wonder my kids don't want to do this nonsense for a living. Now, to hear those words from the author of the film itself, one kind of has to consider the authorial intent of the scene and the film as a whole, and obviously that definitely reinforces the idea that this film is actually about the death of an old way of life, and that the wheel turning here, the neoliberal wheel, has brought in this way of life which is completely unfitting to the Midwest, and thus you see it fall apart. Alberto's cultural heritage has already been eroded itself. He is part Native American, and he's had to adapt to the politics of the land by integrating, even wearing an outfit which looks identical to that of Marcus. You know, Alberto says that 150 years ago, all this was my ancestors' land. Everything you can see, everything you saw yesterday, this was all Comancheria, till the grandparents of all these folks took it. You know, now it's being taken from them, except it ain't no army doing it. And then he points at a bank and he says, it's that son of a bitch right there. Now, that speech is just sort of encapsulating the cyclical argument that we made about the film, about it being the ownership of land itself, which actually is the thing that drives all the oppression or the state of play in the area. The conditions for populist uprising have been present in the land for generations. It's just the controlling evil that's changed its face over time. The difference for Alberto is that his heritage is used against him on ideological grounds, and he finds himself being categorized amongst the seemingly lesser evil of the area. It's this lesser evil which subjects the film to its Trumpian comparison instead of simply being a populist piece. Populism is supposedly less identifiable with a base or particular ideological orientation, but more about a political logic, about an understanding of a certain set of events or a certain set of circumstances which lead to a thing. But the treatment of Alberto would look to kind of contrast that. He is subject to constant teasing from Marcus, which, though isn't actually mean-spirited realistically, it highlights several existing stereotypes at the forefront of white American minds, which make both Mexican and Native American people feel un-American, so to speak. Marcus's teasing is not necessarily why the film earns a Trumpian label. It's actually far more subtle, I think. When the brothers rob the second branch of Texas Midlands in the film, it's very early on. An old man visiting the bank at the time remarks in disbelief, "You ain't even Mexican." And that tiny little addition gives the impression that an anti-immigration attitude is a pre-existing part of the philosophy of those in the area, resonating strongly, obviously, with the messages of the 2016 Trump campaign. In analysing this, however, the Trumpian label can be fairly detached from the film, I think, because Sheridan makes it clear that the uniting factor among the people on this frontier is the anger towards the financial system that keeps them repressed, not the cowboys versus hostile Indian idea, which you get in most westerns, and that that power dynamic which keeps entertaining Marcus. Marcus is intensely attached to Alberto by the end of the film, and he shows his devastation when Alberto is, spoiler warning, when it happens. That emphasises the idea that the oppression of financial organisations is actually a uniting factor amongst the people, and it surpasses concern over race and heritage. I mean, Alberto himself speaks of moving to Florida upon retirement to escape the barren landscape. Obviously, this is a luxury that sort of isn't afforded to him, and Marcus is forced to inherit the future that he didn't want, sitting on his porch, doing nothing. The banks inheriting the land doesn't just result in the loss of that land. The erosion of cultural heritage is a byproduct, and a homeland doesn't simply mean geographic space, but it's more a collation of native origins, birthrights, common loyalties, a sense of rootedness, a shared past, and as a result, the neoliberal institutions which take ownership over everything. That's why when Tanner meets Comanche Bear in a building dedicated solely to the capitalist model of competition and profit maximization in a casino, that's one of my favourite details of the whole film. Tanner meets a Native American man who has been forced out of his home and had his cultural heritage eroded in a casino, which is just the symbol of American capital wealth. Tanner jokes with him that the Comanche are Lord of the Plains, but Bear's response is quite heavy. He says, "Lords of nothing now," in a lower voice than anyone's ever had in history. There is nothing left for Bear to inherit, and as a result, he's resigned himself to that fact. But the phrasing of that response feeds back into the idea about the ownership of land. The Comanche status has been lowered from lords to nothing because their ownership has gone away. Now the new lords are the people who Marcus describes, look like they could foreclose on a house. In this vein, you can look at something like Killers of the Flower Moon and draw a massive comparison there, because the depiction of Native American displacement is evident for all to see. Obviously, it shows the wheel of ownership beginning to turn, displaying, that slow erosion of not just physical space, but cultural heritage dying with it as the Osage people are picked off by the white settler. And then, as Alberto describes, the wheel is spinning fast now, and that ownership is now a responsibility taken on by the banks. So the issue is the neoliberal frontier is made up of markets and numbers, not just physical space. So the physical world begins to die out just as its ancestors did themselves, except less of a fuss is made about it. Going to move on to masculinity now, and how it's shown all over the place in what I completely concede is a masculine-dominated film. The female characters are not prominent, and that should be noted. It's a totally valid criticism. I still love the film, but there's two similar and also fundamentally differing presentations of masculinity here. Tanner is just a live wire, hell-bent on reinforcing his self-confidence, free of care from the opinion of others and willing to do whatever to make himself Lord of the Plains. It's a sort of classic masculine story, but obviously with a hell of a lot of subtext and nuance. Toby isn't exactly much better of a human being, despite having slightly more straight-out morals. He has catch-up to do in terms of looking after his family, but he's aware of his fallibility, and that changes his position massively through the whole film. But, don't feel too much like he wasn't an overly protective man who felt desperate to care for his family in a very traditional sense, because that scene at the petrol station, which I think is just brilliant, it sort of comes out of nowhere, but it hits hard and it works really well. It's not a very subtle reminder of his desperate desire to be a protective figure. But then, of course, there's another study of masculinity where you turn to the Rangers, which is a lot more subtle, I think. Jeff Bridges and Gil Birmingham are just a perfect duo, with one going off pure whim and his senses and being proud to do so, being proud to be American and smart thinking and be the senior. His status gives him a self-belief and a bravado wisdom which he flaunts in his taunting of Alberto. Alberto's a purely family man, self-aware, kind, reasonable, but he lacks the instinct, and that bit of instinct which ultimately means Marcus finds the brothers exactly where he expects. Alberto on his own wouldn't have been able to catch these guys, and I think that's an interesting point to make. You have to be able to think like these masculine figures in order to stop them, and that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Watching two duos playing out like this back to back is just an utter joy. They're both so supremely done. I could have watched another hour of it. It's four bombastic performances, all playing their own subtle take on a masculine character. Jeff Bridges is so emotive. The final scene for him, you feel genuine pain and anguish. It's one of the great modern screen performances. I'm genuinely frustrated it didn't garner more accolades because it's a work of genius. The pauses that Bridges leaves and then the quick witty replies and the excitable moments are all so well measured. I couldn't enjoy it more. I think one of the reasons I love it is just because it's endlessly watchable, but it's grounded and masterfully written by Taylor Sheridan, who I think, whatever reservations, is pretty much a genius. I watched this for the first time in about 2017, 2018, but I left it there for a bit and then I revisited it about 2 years ago and it really, really stuck with me. I think its imagery and its narrative are right at the pinnacle of modern cinema, and it's proof that your film doesn't have to be a huge, expansive, globe-trotting narrative story. He's sort of writing a world he knows brilliantly, and then the idea of putting off retirement, denying the inevitability of time, and doing whatever's possible to delay sitting out on that front porch and being resigned to being obsolete in the world. That's just an enthralling story to watch. There isn't too much going on. Despite all the themes I've mentioned, everything's given its room to fit into the story and breathe. It's a patient film. It doesn't move breakneck. It lets you bask in its environment, something I touched on in last week's episode. Of course, the ending result for both duos is a bleak picture and one which leaves a real bittersweet taste in the mouth. And that feeling is one which doesn't go away for a while after. The music in this is also kick ass from Nick Cave and Warren Ellis. It fits so perfectly, and Nick Cave is just a god, we know that, but it has some excellent, delightful needle drops with music that I have a real soft spot for. So it really is every element of this film that I adore. Hell or High Water shows that, instead of carrying white nationalist set of ideals for uprising, the current force creating conditions for populism is the institutional commodification of the land and all that it brings with it. The film's original title was Comanche, and that highlights that this is a world of nothingness, susceptible to conquest by forces too large for the individual to control. The difference for the outlaw brothers is that they take it upon themselves to escape this structure, come hell or high water. It went so under the radar. Don't let it slip yours. It will reward you, I promise. I hope that hasn't been too much of a nerdy podcast. It's actually proven interesting to me, and it's also made me realise that I should maybe try and do all of my essays as a podcast before I submit them, and then go, oh, that was a bit shit. Rework that bit, Dom, because it doesn't make any sense. Yeah, I'm aware it may have sounded a lot like an essay, and that's probably because a lot of the ideas were taken from my own academic work, whoops, but I spent ages on it, so I thought I'd share it here. And as I say, this is the kind of podcast I can do quite easily at short notice, so if you have enjoyed this, and you'd like to hear me talk more about my other favourites, which might give you some directions to go in, or little ideas to tuck away, then please do let me know. Feedback is always appreciated, it's always nice, and I like to know that anyone listening is interested, and not just getting bored after 5 minutes and switching it off. I have loads of other ideas to get done too. Things will be busy for me with work and etc. starting up soon again, but I'm committed to trying to make this stay regular. Roddy, good friend of the pod, suggested an idea to me which I may bring him and Will back to try out in the coming days if possible. Roddy's game, still waiting on you, Will. Pick up the phone. It's a sort of sofa-style arrangement where we watch a film together and then try and dissect it afterwards and see where it fits into a broader discussion about the film. And as ever with those two, things can go wild quite fast, which we always love. So keep your eyes peeled for that, because I'll be all over it. I'm trying to get that done in the next few days if I can. So thank you very much for downloading the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening. I hope this sounds like an appealing film to you and doesn't just sound like a load of waffle and masculine stuff, because it is a male film. I understand that, and it might be seemingly off-putting for people, which I totally understand, but I do think it rewards you when you invest in it and you let it play out in the way that it's supposed to. I think it's utterly brilliant, and it's on my Letterboxd top 4. I've been doing a lot of work on my Letterboxd to try and remember basically every film I've seen, short of going, all the films I can remember from a kid, but like, do I really want a review of Scooby-Doo animated things on my Letterboxd? I don't know, maybe I do, but yeah, follow me on there, because I've got that now up and running. It's just my name, it's just Don Bajoria, so do give me a follow. Yes, I hope you enjoyed listening, and I will catch you all again very, very soon. Bye!